for cleaner and healthier energy that the world wants. KHNP is growing with the world. A global energy company, Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power. KHNP is South Korea's largest energy company. From the first to the greatest and the best. The early challenges KHNP took on were the first steps forward to producing better energy and have now become great steps in the history of energy production. KHNP is a total energy company. Korea's largest power generation company produces 1/4 of the domestic electric power with renewable energy, such as nuclear power, hydropower, pumped storage power, solar PV, wind power, and fuel cells. KHNP has become the foundation for South Korea's economic development, enriching our lives through stable power supply. KHNP is a global energy company. A company replete with solid corporate assets, an excellent talent pool, and global recognition. By distributing advanced technology to various points around the world in need of electricity, from power plant construction to operation solutions, KHNP is positioned to become the world's leading energy company. KHNP is the leader of the future energy industry, enriching life with eco-friendly energy. KHNP continuously invests in new and renewable energy and R&D. By achieving technological innovations through integration with the Fourth Industrial Revolution, expanding its overseas business and new energy business, KHNP is preparing for a new future. KHNP pursues social values. As a leading company in the energy industry, KHNP paves the way for shared growth through collaboration and win-win growth. As a contributing member of the local community, KHNP actively provides generous support for and takes the initiative in developing the local economy, improving the living environment, and revitalizing the local culture. As a global energy leader, KHNP also strives to fulfill its roles and responsibilities abroad, beyond Korea. A total energy company that grows bigger through change and innovation. A company that constantly challenges itself for a better tomorrow. KHNP is leading the global energy industry. A trusted global energy leader. Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power.
Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power Company is a world-class energy company that plays a pivotal role in providing stable energy through large nuclear and hydropower plants. It is taking lead in providing green energy through nuclear power as well as new and renewable energy sources. Upon its establishment in 2001, KHNP began to actively develop its nuclear power technology and has grown to be the largest power generation company in South Korea, with 5 nuclear power sites in addition to hydro and pumped storage power plants. With its management goal of becoming a global energy leader that empowers the world, KHNP focuses on generating safe and clean electricity. High credit ratings from major credit rating agencies, including Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, prove its sound financial structure and high profitability. Over the past 40 years, the global nuclear industry has gone through a number of crises. KHNP, however, continued construction and operation of nuclear power plants with the highest priority placed on safety and kept on developing technologies and accumulating experience. Such ceaseless efforts have produced an optimized system with nuclear construction to operation. Based on such efforts, KHNP consistently receives high scores in the WANO performance indicator and achieved the lowest unplanned capability loss factor among the world's nuclear powerhouses, with high equipment reliability and operational excellence of its nuclear power plants. Since Korea Unit 1, KHNP has strived to achieve nuclear technology independence. Through persistent efforts, it successfully developed APR-1400, the third-generation reactor, and exported it to the United Arab Emirates, thereby demonstrating its technological excellence to the world. The advanced nuclear power plant led by KHNP includes a number of innovations. The passive auxiliary feed water system keeps the reactor cooled in case of power loss. The core catcher technology contains the molten fuel inside in emergency cases. For major safety systems, the 4-train concept is applied so that one operable train is enough to safely cool down the reactor in an emergency. Aside from the 4 emergency diesel generators, an independent source of emergency power, safety class batteries will be able to keep the plant online for at least 72 hours during a loss of power event. The design includes many reinforced safety measures intended to deal with natural disasters for operating power plants. Based on these technological enhancement and greater safety, KHNP acquired design certification from the US NRC as well as the European utility requirements. KHNP is directing all its efforts to satisfy the safety standards of the global market. Through its global presence and cooperation with international organizations, KHNP has accumulated a track record of nuclear exports and is collaborating with many countries in Europe, Asia, and the Americas to create various business models. Based on a solid supply chain, extensive construction experience, and skilled manpower, KHNP has established the highest level of project management capabilities and IT-based management systems, which allow the construction of quality nuclear power plants in a timely manner. Moreover, Korea's solid infrastructure for nurturing human resources allows for systematic training programs, which have enabled provision of training services to the existing and potential customers. As such, KHNP continues to go the extra mile to grow together with its global partners. Energy has great power to enrich people's lives and move the world. Technology for making that energy and underlying passion are the greatest values that KHNP upholds. A company that powers the world with cutting-edge technology. a top 3 global energy leader. KHNP is ready to be your trusted global energy partner.
Good evening, or good afternoon, good morning. Thank you, Laura, for this special participation. And our distinguished NEREC alumni or speakers, I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for your participation. And I'll just hand over to Professor Soyoung Kim, who will be chairing and moderating the session. I realized that Professor Kim is sort of waiting for me to come in and say hello and then just go away. So Professor Kim, now it's all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Im. This is the second session of NEREC Conference 2021. And I guess this is the first session that we are having in this style, meaning that we have alumni, fellows presenting for this session. And the session is supposed to review the current status of global nuclear non-proliferation and also make prognosis of the future. And some of the questions we are examining in this session are what are the key nuclear non-proliferation issues and also challenges around the globe, and what can you do to cope with such challenges? For example, as the China-US relationship develops into really serious tensions, whether political or technological, which we often describe as a new Cold War. What are the implications of such contentions and tensions in global nuclear security and non-proliferation? So without further ado, let me just introduce how this session is going to be organized. We have a keynote speech by Ms. Laura Rockwood, and then we have 3 presenters of former fellows, and finally we have comments by Dr. Francesca Giovannini. Let me just introduce one by one. First, we have the keynote speech by Ms. Rockwood, and she is the director of Open Nuclear Network, which is a program of One Earth Future. She has over 30 years of experience in non-proliferation and international safeguards. She also has published extensively on safeguards and non-proliferation. Ms. Rockwood retired from the IAEA in November 2013, as the section head for non-proliferation policy in the Office of Legal Affairs after 28 years of service. And now I'm reading just a really long profile of hers, which is really impressive. And you can find her activities all over, I guess, within IAEA and also outside this organization. And she was particularly made a very strong contributions to several negotiations, and also she was the principal author of the document that became the model additional protocol. As I said, she participated in high-level negotiations on Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, as well as in the IAEA U.S.-Russian Federation negotiations on the trilateral initiative and the plutonium management and disposition agreement. So we will be having her keynote speech for about 15 minutes, after which we have 3 presentations. So Ms. Rockwood, can you just go ahead?
I certainly can, and I'm extremely pleased and very honored to be here with you today. So thank you for the opportunity. This week, we'll be mourning the loss of some 200,000 souls on the 76th anniversaries of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the first, and God help us, only use of nuclear weapons. While no nuclear weapons have been used in war or by accident since then, a key achievement of the non-proliferation regime, it is important to remind ourselves that this may have been as much down to luck as to policy. And there are many worrying trends that call into question how long that luck will hold. In 1986, Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. 4 decades later, we return to this common sense principle with Presidents Biden, Putin, and Xi recently reaffirming the truth of this proposition. While important and welcome, it is a true sign of our times. For we stand on the precipice of a renewed nuclear arms race. As So Young mentioned, a new Cold War, only this time between 3 superpowers. We've lost some of the key achievements in arms control from the previous decades following the demise of the INF and Open Skies treaties, and we had a near miss on the non-extension of the New START. The nuclear possessor states are pressing forward with modernization and development of their nuclear arsenals, signaling their continued reliance on nuclear weapons. For their part, many non-nuclear weapon states have become increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in the implementation by the NPT nuclear weapon states of their Article 6 obligation to pursue negotiations in good faith on the cessation of the nuclear arms race and nuclear disarmament. This frustration, accompanied by a renewed recognition of the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, has led to the first global treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the TPNW, or the so-called ban treaty. Unfortunately, the rhetoric employed by both proponents and opponents of the ban treaty has devolved into uncivil attacks, with supporters of the ban calling the extended deterrence allies of the nuclear weapon states weasel states, and opponents challenging ban treaty supporters as naive dreamers and being unserious about disarmament. The fact that the postponed 10th NPT review conference and the very first meeting of the states parties to the TPNW are scheduled to take place on overlapping dates and in different cities doesn't inspire great confidence that the schism between the groups can be bridged anytime soon. On other fronts, efforts by American and Iranian negotiators to rediscover common ground and restore the JCPOA also appear in peril as antagonism between the two sides reinserts itself into the process as we all await the inauguration of the new Iranian President Raisi in just 2 days. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has completed its review of its North Korea policy and announced that it would assume a calibrated, practical approach open to diplomacy with North Korea towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. However, the details are few, and the US overtures aimed at restarting talks have not yet borne fruit, with Kim Jong-un saying they are prepared for diplomacy or confrontation. North Korea appears to be awaiting concrete action by the United States, while it remains in self-imposed isolation, preventing all North Korean officials from traveling. And let's consider the intersection between nuclear and cyber, and nuclear and the weaponization of outer space. As barriers to the development of cyber and space capabilities have fallen away, these communities will need to continue to adapt their strategies to protect against the potentially destabilizing impacts these capacities could entail, both at the state and non-state actor levels. Nuclear programs need to be better insulated from cyber attacks. Rules of the road should be developed to protect critical infrastructure, including nuclear fuel cycle activities, and in particular, nuclear weapon command and control systems. Although analogies to nuclear arms control agreements have been drawn, addressing cyber threats will be much more difficult due to the more ephemeral nature of their threats and the challenges of monitoring and enforcing any cyber agreement. Moreover, unlike nuclear weapons, the use of cyber weapons is cheap, effective, and easy to deny. Outer space remains the next frontier in terms of arms control. While the 1967 Outer Space Treaty prohibits states from placing nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or stationing them in outer space, there has been zero progress on a code of conduct addressing the potential deployment of allegedly defensive space weaponry that could also be used for offensive purposes to disable another state's nuclear strike capability. With countries becoming increasingly reliant on space-based capabilities for maintaining situational awareness for their security postures, particular attention must be paid to the increasing risk of opportunities for deception and disruption that could, intentionally or inadvertently, escalate conflict up to and including the point where decision makers could be confronted with a decision to use or lose their nuclear weapons. And finally, enhanced cooperation between governments, industry, international organizations, and the export control regimes will be required to address the novel challenges to nonproliferation posed by emerging technologies such as additive manufacturing, while harnessing the potential benefits of such hybrid technologies for the good of humanity. The thrice delayed 10th NPT Review Conference, now scheduled to take place in January next year, will have to confront these issues, as well as the perennial and intractable issue of a Middle East WMD free zone. Progress on even one of these fronts could create forward momentum, not just for those discrete issue areas, but for the entire international nonproliferation regime. Sadly, prospects for agreement on a final document are dim, and optimism about a positive outcome for the RevCon is low. But this speaks to the need to reinvigorate enthusiasm for international commitments, placing diplomacy ahead of coercion and war as the paramount tool for achieving nonproliferation goals. The use of force, whether threatened or actual, more frequently results in the unintended consequence of contributing to the adversary's justification of its own pursuit of nuclear weapons. Durable negotiated solutions offer the only robust path forward. Although nuclear weapons and nonproliferation policies are typically viewed as elite-driven issues, accessible only to a very small community of experts, the reality is that such threats pose potentially dire consequences for humanity as a whole. And yet, the public is not always given access by governments to credible and reliable information about issues associated with about threats to international peace and security. Democratizing access to information about issues associated with nuclear weapons can be complicated by their necessarily classified nature. That such information cannot be shared between adversaries is clear. That such information is not always shareable, even within governments, is less appreciated, but also real. Using open source data and new technologies, civil society, including NGOs and academia, can and should play an important role in filling this information gap to raise awareness and increase knowledge about these issues. Now, this is especially the case for young people. A recent survey of individuals aged from 20 to 35 from 16 different countries found that roughly 80% of the respondents agreed that nuclear weapons were a threat to humanity. Nearly 64% of this group also agreed that countries with nuclear weapons should eliminate them. Yet when this very same group was asked what the biggest issue facing the world was, nuclear weapons came last out of a list of 12, with fewer than 1 in 4 identifying this issue as more pressing than, for example, corruption, poverty, global warming. It seems that while young people around the world are keenly aware of the threat posed by these weapons, they do not feel the same sense of urgency with respect to that threat as they do with respect to other economic and security concerns. As we look toward the future, it is clear there's no shortage of work that needs to be done to bolster non-proliferation efforts and promote the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. What gives me hope in that regard is that our field continues to attract the bright young minds. It's up to us collectively here at this conference and elsewhere to ensure there is both continuity of knowledge and continuity of enthusiasm for the principle expressed in the preamble of the NPT that the devastation that would be visited upon all mankind by a nuclear war gives rise to the consequent need to make every effort to avert the danger of such a war and to take measures to safeguard the security of peoples. Living up to this principle, however, will require increasing the sense of urgency among young people. Young people have the ability to inject new energy into global non-proliferation efforts. And this is as true for future negotiators and policymakers as it is for future advocates and organizers within civil society. For only by leveraging this full spectrum of energy and talent will we be able to reverse this deeply worrying trend we've seen in recent years. And with that, I thank you once again for the opportunity to address you and look forward to hearing from the rest of our speakers. Thank you, Soyoung.
Thank you very much for the very, very insightful speech, especially to me. It's really surprising to see the gap between in the poll between the importance of nuclear weapons versus the urgency of nuclear weapon issues. And this is really a challenge for us. It seems like almost a climate change kind of situation. You know, everybody understands climate change is the top global challenge, but as to the urgency of the issue, we are not yet quite alert on the crisis. So we have 3 presentations, starting with, just wait a minute, starting with Ms. Saima Amansayal. As I said, all are our alumni. So let me very briefly introduce Saima. She's working as a senior research officer and expert in strategic issues at the Center for International Strategic Studies, CISS in Islamabad. She's also the associate editor of CISS Insight, which is published by this center. She's also an international law fellow from Research Society for International Law, and also she has a Master of Philosophy in Strategic Studies from National Defense University. Previously, she served as a research coordinator and senior research associate in the Center for Pakistan and Gulf Studies and Strategic Technology Research Studies, Islamabad. She has extensive experience of working with various divisions of important organizations in Pakistan. So I'm not going to read all the profiles. Still, this is quite long. So I'll just hand over the floor to Saima. Saima, can you just start off?
And thank you so much. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Aim and his excellent team for the invitation to speak in this August panel. And I'm very nostalgic as I see this conference happening right now. I'm also pleased to note a balanced representation of gender on the panel. And I feel that's really important considering the times that we are in. Let me also take this opportunity to congratulate the fellows, both undergrad and grad fellows that are graduating this year from this fellowship. And I'd like to say all the best for your academic and professional pursuits. Now, I think Laura has very well set the ground for the discussion. And this year marks the 51st anniversary of NPT's entry into force, a significant moment of accomplishment. However, we see, and as Laura has pointed out, several challenges still remain. The world still has over 13,000 nuclear warheads, several under enhanced readiness, new sophisticated ballistic, cruise, hypersonic weapons, alongside a drive towards lethal autonomous weapons, and there are talks about the integration of artificial intelligence into nuclear force-related systems. This year, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock to 100 minutes to midnight. That is the closest that it has ever been to a nuclear apocalypse. Now, the statement that accompanied the press release stated, and I quote, that accelerating nuclear programs in multiple countries moved the world into less stable and manageable territory last year. Development of hypersonic glide vehicles, ballistic missile defenses, and weapon delivery systems that can flexibly use conventional or nuclear warheads may raise the probability of miscalculation in times of tension. Nuclear nations, however, have ignored or undermined practical and available diplomatic and security tools for managing these risks. Now, before I start talking about the challenges that the nuclear non-proliferation regime faces, I have to make a statement. I feel that the biggest challenge to the nuclear non-proliferation is from the projection of nuclear weapons as being central to a state's security system. For example, when major states and major nuclear powers and alliances like NATO make statements about retaining nuclear arsenals as long as nuclear weapons exist, it undermines the goal of nuclear non-proliferation as well as disarmament. I'd like to recall a statement that was made by the US President JF Kennedy back in some 60s, where he predicted that around 20 states would acquire nuclear weapon capability in some years. And since the entry into force of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we find that only 4 states have become nuclear weapon states, which I think is an achievement of the NPT, which is worth mentioning. The NPT did codify the norm on stopping the further spread of nuclear weapons. However, the grand bargain that was struck between the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots, that has not been upheld in a manner that it would have been. With the non-nuclear weapon states having frustrated with the progress towards nuclear disarmament, and hence there is this widening gulf between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, which has manifested itself in the failure of 4 out of 9 RevCons of the NPT. Now, as we see, the TPNW process seems to be further deepening this divide, considering the fact that none of the nuclear weapon states are party to the treaty. To turn to some of the major challenges that the nuclear non-proliferation regime confronts, in my view. Firstly, the continued modernization programs in the nuclear weapon states, in United States, Russia, that account for over 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal, as well as in other nuclear weapon states, is a challenge to the NPT's Article 6 commitment to pursue negotiations in good faith towards cessation of an arms race at an early date and nuclear disarmament. The 2018 Nuclear Posture Review by the United States clearly stated that Washington would deploy nuclear weapons as a response to non-nuclear strategic attacks. It also claimed that the US would deploy low-yield nuclear weapons to keep the flexible response options open. Now, this re-emphasizes the growing salience of nuclear weapons for states with most advanced conventional militaries in the world. This kind of review has far-reaching implications for the Russian and Chinese nuclear doctrines. Moreover, it has a cascading effect on the regional nuclear rivalries, and it promotes vertical proliferation. In the absence of a global norm to codify vertical non-proliferation, the regional nuclear competition continues to endanger regional as well as global strategic stability. Development of low-yield nuclear weapons, hypersonic cruise missiles, and other emerging technologies that enhance the nuclear readiness, counter-force targeting capabilities, they all accelerate the arms race, undermine the prospects for arms control, and in turn undermine non-proliferation. Now, another challenge to the treaty emanates from the contradiction within the provisions of it and how they've been implemented. The Article 1 and 2 of the non-proliferation clauses of the NPT, and they obligate the nuclear weapon states not to transfer nuclear weapons or other explosive devices to any recipient, and refrain non-nuclear weapon state not to receive such materials. However, we see that US, Russian, Australian, Japanese, several other uranium supplies to India through the NSG waiver, a state that is outside the NPT, in contravention of the NPT clauses. A similar case might even be made for the Russian assistance in building the 80 megawatt pressurized water reactor for India's nuclear submarine program. The NPT review the RevCon process, the review conferences, in 1995, when the treaty was extended, made a case for the indefinite extension for NPT, apart from the working towards CTBT ratification and FMCT negotiations. But we see that the promise for conducting a conference on the WMDO free zone in the Middle East is nowhere to be seen near. And this was one of the reasons that the 2015 RevCon actually ended in failure. Now, this is a challenge for the future efficacy of the review process. Also, Israel has successfully been able to mar this process of discussions on it, even without being a member of the NPT. So, you know, this is, I actually wanted to comment on there are several issues within the NPT, but I'd leave the Article 4, which relates to the alienable right to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and the withdrawal clause, Article 10, and the challenges they offer for the other worthy panelists because of paucity of time. Now, I'd like to focus on other aspects of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, including the CTBT, the Fissile Material Treaty debate, the multilateral export control regimes or groups, as you may want to call them. Now, CTBT is an important element of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, especially as it engaged both India and Pakistan after they had overtly tested their nuclear weapons. However, the treaty has yet to enter into force, largely owing to the failure of the US Senate to ratify the treaty. Now, why I say this is because a state with large stocks of nuclear weapons and with sophisticated technology, if the US is unwilling to abide to the non-proliferation goals that are being set by the treaty, it is hard to bring other states on board. So that is sort of a stumbling block. Albeit the non-ratification, I must note that all nuclear weapon states exercise a moratorium on further testing, except for North Korea. However, reports in Foreign Policy and other media outlets back in 2015 pointed to evidence of India building a massive secret complex in its bid to build a hydrogen bomb. The failure of the international community to bind India into strong non-proliferation commitments while simultaneously giving it advanced dual-use technology has adversely undermined the non-proliferation norms globally, and apart from that also created stability challenges within South Asia. Coming to another issue, the issue of the fissile material ban has been contentious between the non-proliferation and disarmament camp within the Conference on Disarmament. Those states that only seek to promote the non-proliferation agenda propagate a ban only on the future production of fissile material, whereas those that promote the twin objective of nuclear non-proliferation as well as disarmament seek a fissile material treaty which includes the existing stocks of the fissile material. Now, a future ban, some say, would be cost-free for states where there are huge stocks of fissile materials. For an FMT to be effective and credible, it must verifiably halt further production of weapon-usable materials, as well as also entail accountability and transparency for the existing stocks in the nuclear possessor states. The norm on vertical proliferation, as I outlined, hasn't been codified yet, and hence it is leading to both qualitative and quantitative arms race. The asymmetric proliferation of emerging technologies, advanced dual-use defense technologies, by powerful states in conflict-infested regions is accentuating the security dilemma and is leading nuclear dyads into further instability and arms competition. Now, another issue in the Conference on Disarmament is which agenda is ripe for discussion versus negotiations. There is disagreement among states on simultaneous progress on all four agenda items on the CD's agenda, which are the negative security assurances, nuclear disarmament, prohibition of an arms race in outer space, PAROS, and Laura has already pointed out to the issues that PAROS, the arms race in outer space, is posing for the stability, and the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. Now, a major challenge to the NNPR, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Regime, is the lack of assurance by nuclear weapon states to the non-nuclear weapon states of the threat of use of nuclear weapons. When states like US and Russia and others fail to commit to no first use against non-nuclear weapon states, despite their strong militaries, it threatens the non-nuclear weapon states and sort of undermines their security. Now, considering that security is one of the predominant reasons for nuclear proliferation by states, negative security assurance can serve as a strong non-proliferation tool. Finally, I'd like to talk about the case of expansion of the Nuclear Suppliers Group membership, a cartel that came into being after India diverted fuel from a Canadian-supplied heavy water reactor to conduct a nuclear test ostensibly for peaceful purposes. The 2008 NSG exemption that was made or given to India to conduct nuclear commerce has done most significant damage to the credibility of the non-proliferation regime. The fact that a country that was outside the NPT was given an exemption based on subjective notions of good non-proliferation record is a challenge in the face of the non-proliferation norms. Now, the separation plan of the Indian nuclear facilities allowed New Delhi to keep 8 of its nuclear facilities outside safeguards, including its uranium enrichment program, as well as its fast breeder reactors. Now, in exchange for the 2008 waiver, the United States made India agree to work towards an early negotiations of a Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty in a bid to make India commit to stronger non-proliferation norms. India, however, still continues to produce fissile material at a very fast rate in its strategic weapons program and is enriching uranium under the pretense of producing fuel for its submarine program. Now, the capacity of the plant to produce uranium is much more than the requirement of the submarine fuel. Just a single facility in South India has the capacity of 100,000 separative work units, and which is way more than what India needs for its submarine program. It claims to go for a fleet of 3 to 5 submarines. Furthermore, there are no safeguards on its enrichment program that verify that the material it produces for this reactor is not diverted to production of the strategic weapons. Now, India has huge quantities of reactor-grade plutonium that have been kept outside safeguards, and they remain available for military use. And it's not obligated to allow for the tracking of the nuclear fuel supplies that are done to it by the fuel suppliers. Now, these exceptions, and why am I talking about this is because these exceptions undermine the non-nuclear weapon states' commitment to the NPT, where they're not even allowed to have fuel cycle facilities without very specific guarantees, albeit being party to the treaty, while an NPT nuclear possessor state is being granted an exemption based on geopolitical and economic interest of the nuclear suppliers. This is clearly a case of undermining the non-proliferation regime by NSG through selective application of rules. Talking about the issue of prospective membership in the NSG, the participating governments should come up with criteria that uniformly promotes the non-proliferation norms rather than a country-specific approach. The NSG once missed an opportunity to integrate CTBT and tangible non-proliferation commitments like adherence to NPT articles as non-proliferation criteria for access to peaceful uses of nuclear energy in 2008. It shouldn't yet again, as any such move would be a deadly blow for the NPT RevCon process, as well as for the reputation of the NSG as a group that promotes non-proliferation objectives. Finally, I'd like to suggest some ways to address these challenges. Nuclear proliferation, as I've said, is a symptom of the underlying regional insecurities of the state. Therefore, it is important to address the underlying security issues that result in demands for nuclear weapons acquisition in the first place. The US and Russia should revive the bilateral arms control framework and pursue other risk reduction measures that can be expanded later to involve the other nuclear weapon states. In South Asia, I feel that Pakistan had made a proposal of the strategic restraint regime with its three interlocking elements of nuclear, missile, and nuclear and missile restraint, conventional force balances, and the resolution of outstanding disputes. I think that could be a good starting point for discussions and dialogues. Now, to address the issue of a state's security motivations to acquire nuclear weapons, there is a need to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons in the security doctrines of the nuclear possessor states or nuclear weapon states, whichever way we want to put them, through limiting the role, the reliance of the nuclear weapons, the variety of platforms, the types of technologies. This could begin with the declaration of the no first use of nuclear weapons given, it could be with the United States, given the advanced conventional capabilities, and the other states could simultaneously make pledges. There is a need to forge a new consensus on non-proliferation principles by the nuclear possessor states. This can happen through a dialogue between them on non-proliferation goals, like simultaneous adherence to NPT Article 1, Article 3.2, Article 6, which talks about disarmament, ratification of CTBT, signing ratification, working towards a fissile material treaty that accounts for transparency and existing stocks of weapon-usable nuclear material, and committing to strong nuclear safety and security standards. In the end, I'd like to say that the first special session on disarmament, which was the 10th session of the United Nations General Assembly held in 1978, the SSOD-1, it forged a consensus on nuclear disarmament enshrined in the principle of equal and undiminished security for all. This should be the guiding principle in all future non-proliferation pursuits if a normative approach to the nuclear non-proliferation regime has to be propagated and adhered to universally. I'd like to thank all.
Okay. Thank you very much, Saima, for your very extensive and also very, very impressive coverage of what's going on in the global landscape of non-proliferation, especially with respect to specific NPT articles. Thank you again. And now we are moving to the second presentation, which is by Sahil Shah. Nice to meet you again. Sahil is a past fellow at the European Leadership Network. In this role, Sahil advises the senior US, European, and other government stakeholders on reducing strategic and nuclear risks and convenes international security dialogues. Sahil is also a past advisor to the Institute for Security and Technology on its Catalink project, and recently reprised his previously role as a past and outreach consultant to the Office of Executive Secretary at CTBTO. Among many recognitions, let me introduce the fact that he was named as the 2021 Schultz-Gorbachev Voices Youth Awardee. This is an incredible honor created by these former leaders in their namesake to acknowledge a compelling leadership and creativity. And finally, he is also part of the inaugural class of 2021 Aspen Strategic Group Rising Leaders. Sahil also has worked closely with former Secretary of Defense William Perry as a member of the Perry Project Advisory Board and many other activities. So without further ado, let's just move ahead. So Sahil, can you just start?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you first and foremost to Professor Yim for the invitation to speak, and to Laura and Saima so far for great opening comments. Before I begin, I definitely want to highlight the value of the NEREC program and intergenerational dialogues in general. You know, we definitely have a continuing need for knowledge transfer and talent attraction and retention in our field of nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament. And the only way we can do that is if we bring everyone together, take stock of where we are, and really plan for the future together. And I think the opportunity that NEREC provides to have young people come together in Daejeon and then travel not only in Korea, but also in China and Japan is really, really eye-opening and important, especially due to how pivotal the region and the security status in the region is at the moment. I'd like to begin with the current context that we're operating in. At the beginning of the pandemic last year, Jeffrey Lewis from the Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute noted in an interview that a pandemic is just a kind of nuclear war in slow motion, and that preventing nuclear war and managing a pandemic require the same conceptual approach. Some of the parallels that he drew, which I agree with, included complexity, flawed or limited information, possibly compressed decision-making time, and that the quality of government and governance really, really matter. Shada Islam of the Friends of Europe also wrote a piece shortly after that on the pandemic, which focused on European responses. And she noted at that point that we need to start planning right away, we need to start acknowledging and making a case for collective action, and that we need to provide visible solidarity. And she noted in her piece early last year that it's not idealistic to expect international cooperation in times of crisis. Over the last year at various points of the pandemic, especially in relation to healthcare performance and response, including vaccine procurement, international cooperation has been lacking and notions of competition have really taken over. And I think that it's really important for us to assess the nexus between the pandemic and nuclear weapons, given both pose existential risk to the planet and what has happened over, say, the last 18 months. Amidst grappling with COVID, the current 9 nuclear-armed states increased their spending on nuclear weapons by $1.4 billion. And while, for example, I feel it is indeed too early to chart current US-China dynamics as being that of a new Cold War, it's very obvious that great power competition continues to have nuclear implications. And, the US, Russia, and China are not the only nuclear players today with rather poor relations. And as we are all aware, there's multiple pairings of nuclear armed competitors. And the issue is that most of them actually have no history of formal arms control. For example, the US and Russia arms control relationship is truly in its infancy, and such a reality should guide expectations of what is possible. Many have put forward proposals on what can be done to build confidence with and inspire transparency from Beijing. But from where I sit normally in Europe, I'm currently in DC at the moment, but I'm normally based in London. There are 2 important issues that should be resolved and, brought forward to bring about results in that regard. I think the first absolutely is tangible US progress with Russia on strategic stability, so that Moscow has at least some incentive to bring Beijing in, and the revitalization of the P5 process and wider dialogue among them on nuclear issues. Last week, the US and Russia met in Geneva. The long arc of strategic stability talks under the previous US administration, starting in 2017, was always supposed to result in the creation of these expert level working groups, which are now going to be mobilized again. And, after a few rounds at the political level, the design even then was to have these working groups sort out specific issues. There was never a US-Russia agreement on the process at the outset, but that's how these things have traditionally gone. As we know, Russia had canceled the second round of strategic stability talks in 2018 in March, and then basically the talks weren't resumed for more than a year, after which the US primarily used them to hold the New START treaty extension hostage in what I feel as an American and a European, a rather misguided effort to have Russia bring Beijing to the table. This obviously failed. The opportunities tied to the change in US administration, especially after the extension of New START rather quickly after President Biden was inaugurated, are game changers. It's very important to note also that the US is undergoing a nuclear posture review at the moment, which also adds an important dimension in the geometry of these talks, as well as wider P5 and international diplomacy on nuclear issues. It's an important opportunity for the new US administration, which is strengthening the interagency process that produces the NPR, actually consulting with allies and listening to civil society even from now, to very clearly reflect the president's thinking on nuclear weapons. On the day of the US-Russia presidential summit in June in Geneva, a Russian colleague, Andrei Batlitsky, and I published a few recommendations in Kommersant newspaper and Responsible Statescraft. We really hoped that both leaders would reiterate this Reagan-Gorbachev statement in 1985 that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, mainly as an organizing principle and a leader-level signal. We also hope for the creation of strategic stability dialogue tracks with a deadline for progress, inspired by those in the 1980s. But first, to have both sides assess threat perceptions and come to an understanding of what each side considers strategic and why. And then breaking into groups that looked at first, perhaps limits on strategic nuclear forces, second, missile defense and space security, and third, non-strategic nuclear weapons, as well as conventional precision guided systems. And that last, our third recommendation was that both parties should really pursue resolution to outstanding arms control compliance issues, including, say, US concerns over potential Russian low-yield nuclear testing, which would be contrary to their testing moratorium and, of course, the CTBT. And second, of course, Russian concerns over potential US non-compliance with New START due to its modification of heavy bombers and missile launchers of nuclear submarines. On the first, on Reagan-Gorbachev, while I'm not always thrilled by statement therapy as a replacement for action, the president's reaffirming the statement was crucial to help give an organizing principle mainly to their own governments and publics to show leadership and to say that this is the reality of where we would like the US-Russia relationship to head towards, which is one that is more predictable and stable, and one that acknowledges that the use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible and should be prevented at all costs. And it would be very helpful if the wider P5 said this collectively, which is something that my organization, the European Leadership Network, has been looking at very closely, especially when it comes to European powers, because it's very clear that while Russia has supported the statement for quite some time, which was evident through its inclusion in the Russia-China presidential statement that followed in the weeks after Geneva, the UK and France are quite hesitant as they feel that the statement was said in a bilateral setting, in a completely different historical context, and that there's varying levels of trust that Russia and President Putin, more specifically, actually believes the statement. I think that it's important that the P5 come to an understanding either on reiterating that statement or a variant of it. And I hope that when they gather in France in December or in November or December for a principals level meeting, that we'll see some of that action, especially before the new dates of the NPT review conference currently slated for January. On the second, which are the recommendations for the strategic stability tracks, it's really good to note that after last week's meetings, that both sides have gotten reacquainted and that many proposals have already been put on the table at that initial meeting, and that the working groups can assess them between now and September when they reconvene, and that the immediate goal isn't a grand bargain, but step-by-step, implementable and pragmatic measures and understandings, which I think is a wise course to take so that we can really chart what can come after New START, and if it in fact will be a formal treaty or if it'll look like something else. And on the third, it's very important, especially on the American side, after the last US administration's treatment of major arms control non-proliferation agreements, that the institutional scaffolding that's tied to these agreements that still exist, like the CTBT, like New START, that it is actually used to resolve compliance concerns. So with the CTBT, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, it needs to be celebrated and championed, and it needs to stay at the top of the non-proliferation and disarmament agenda. But it's not helpful when the great powers are trading accusations of low-yield testing and when they're still leaving the treaties in limbo by not ratifying them. At present, we're very proud of the Commission that 302 IMS facilities have been certified. The figures represent almost 90% of the network foreseen by the treaty. This has enhanced coverage and resilience of the network, and it assists the Commission in providing a wide range of data to state signatories on a continual basis. And that data is not just used to monitor for nuclear tests, but to actually help with disaster risk reduction, to look at climate change studies, and many other important scientific endeavors. In addition, it's very clear that the treaty is de facto working, but we can't allow it to be a victim of its own success. The real goal is full universalization and its entry into force. And in here, I think the P5 have a special responsibility. Only France, out of all 5 of those nuclear powers, has completed its segment of the international monitoring system. And there are confidence building measures under the treaty that could be used to help build transparency, like reciprocal test site visits. And the US has actually put this on the table. And I think the Biden administration is quite serious with the offer to have the US, China, and other P5 players come and visit the Nevada test site, for example. And I think that those offers should be taken up. As Laura mentioned, this month marks the 76th anniversary of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And while the first and last use of a nuclear weapon in warfare was indeed over 7 decades ago, it's important to not forget that nuclear testing completely changed the planet and also caused grave humanitarian and environmental impacts. In fact, if you aggregate the total yield of atmospheric tests alone, it is the equivalent of 2 Hiroshima-sized bombs being exploded every day in open air for 35 years straight. So we must keep the memory of all nuclear victims and affected communities alive. And before I move on to the P5 process, I want to talk about domestic reactions to that presidential summit between the US and Russia and what that means for our community as nonproliferation experts. It's particularly eye-opening to see how much coverage in the US, for example, vilified and almost criminalized the fact that President Biden sat down with his Russian counterpart, despite the stakes and despite the fact that they were sitting down largely to talk about issues of an existential nature to both countries. And the idea that the US and Russia could talk about nuclear stability and security, that should always continue regardless of the bilateral relationship. And similar reactions existed in Moscow. And on both sides, we saw many political forces double down on the utility of nuclear weapons and dismiss the utility of arms control at the same time. For example, nuclear weapons were invoked as a useful political asset. On Russia's most watched weekend TV show on state-owned channel Russia 1 on that Sunday, the host directly attributed the meeting to the US realization that Russia could, quote, turn it into radioactive ash, and linked the summit's outcome to the success for Russia's weapons and apparent reference to a number of advanced systems that Moscow had promoted in recent years. And I think that it's very important that us as a community don't get stuck in our own echo chambers, and that we really do spend time working with the public and informing them of why diplomacy works, why it has in the past really reduced risks, and why nuclear weapons don't hold the utility that some try to say that they do. In terms of the P5 grouping, the new US administration sees the P5 process as complementary to its efforts for bilateral strategic dialogues with Russia, and if they ever get to it, with China. The pandemic slowed down the momentum seen in London in February of last year when the principals gathered at Lancaster House. It was envisioned that strategic stability talks actually would start amongst all 5 powers, beginning on the sidelines of the NPT review conference, originally scheduled a few months after, but now, of course, twice postponed. And the working groups that have been convened over the last few years, from when China hosted, then the UK, and now France, they hope to present some of their findings at the RevCon at 2 side events, which will be very interesting. One on nuclear doctrines and the other on peaceful uses. The French, who have now taken over this process, are very keen to get it back on track operationally, now that the pandemic is hopefully turning a corner. And they're focused on one specific core important issue that I want to raise, which is strategic risk reduction. The idea is that the P5 would like to take a more strategic approach to nuclear risk reduction. They don't want to limit the debate of nuclear risk reduction, but take into account the overall strategic context as they feel that the biggest nuclear risks today reside in misperception and miscommunication. So I'd love to take the opportunity to quickly talk about a project that was mentioned that I'm advising on called Catalink out of the Institute for Security and Technology, because it really shows how bringing science and policy together can really bring out inventive solutions to nonproliferation and disarmament and nuclear challenges in general. The hotline that we're developing is meant to be internationally driven, radically secure, and resilient, especially, for example, in the face of a nuclear attack. It seeks to add to, and in some cases, replace existing hotlines, which are aging and are technically vulnerable. And when it comes to crisis communications, there are technical challenges to communicating securely over long distances, particularly when the environment has been degraded by conflict or, again, in the worst case scenario, nuclear use. And on top of these physical challenges are also disruptive official announcements and documents, statements to the media, tweets and social media, as well as the now increasing risks of hacking, signal interception, firmware, software, and hardware vulnerabilities. Additionally, in a world where no conceivable nuclear conflict would involve only two nuclear armed states, or not only two, but more than that, it's alarming that there now are only limited bilateral hotlines. So what we're hoping to build is something that's more multilateral and will allow for quick, secure communication, specifically between heads of state. And I'm really glad to say that the Swiss government has signed up as the first kind of non-nuclear weapons sponsor state and is going to be supporting us in this effort. Last but not least, I'm not going to discuss North Korea because we have colleagues on the call from the Korean Peninsula who will be able to talk about the ongoing events far better. But because my main responsibilities at the ELN are managing and running our Iran portfolio, I just wanted to touch on it very briefly and say that, despite facing great turbulence and almost death over the last few years, the JCPOA is indeed still alive, even as a skeleton agreement, and that in and of itself is a huge triumph of Iranian patience, European, Russian, Chinese diplomacy, and that today a new Iranian president has been inaugurated, and that there's a large looming question over what will happen due to the current break in negotiations after the 6 rounds of talks that have occurred in Vienna, including informal consultations with the US Iran envoy and the wider team that has been also present in Vienna, despite not being in the room, but down the road. I'm still very optimistic based on my assessment and also conversations with officials, but it will require both sides to make concessions based on an honest assessment of where we are today and how that compares to when the deal was negotiated and then implemented by all sides before the US withdrew. It's also going to require a baseline understanding of where the parties would like to head if, and this is a big if the JCPOA proves to be a durable, stable, and truly win-win agreement like it was intended to be. It's important in turn for the new US administration to really focus on effective sanctions relief if Iran also agrees to the terms and returns to the nuclear limits under the agreement. So this odd saga this year and game of chicken that ensued with both sides wanting the other to move first really wasted precious time during a pandemic that is greatly affecting both nations and causing a lot of competing priorities. So I think the core kind of kernel of truth or lesson to be learned is that we shouldn't allow perfect to become the enemy of the good, and that we have to be honest about other countries' threat perceptions, take accountability, take stock of where we are, and to try to move forward in a way that is mutually beneficial, which of course, always, as is true in multilateralism, requires concessions by all sides. And I'm very hopeful that the JCPOA can get back on track and that it can continue to serve as a model for future nonproliferation agreements, especially due to the incredible technical prowess that is included in the agreement, and that some on the call, like Laura, have helped work very hard over a number of years to perfect. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Sahil. You covered all the interesting and important latest developments in this nuclear diplomacy, including US-Russia Presidential Summit This almost looks like a coverage by New York Times news reporter, right? Let me just move on to the final presentation. This is by Dr. Jae-won Lee. Jae-won is a visiting research fellow with the Institute of International Affairs at the Seoul National University. His research interests include international security, allied assurance and control, and nuclear non-proliferation. And he's also interested particularly in Asian non-proliferation export control as part of the U.S. security architecture in the region. Jae-won had appointments with the Global Commerce Institute at Lee & Co. and also South Korea's largest government research institute for science and technology policy, which is STEPI, and also dual use and arms trade control programs at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So, Jae-won, can you go ahead?
Thank you, Professor So-young Kim. It's happy to see you again. I was a NEREC research fellow in 2017, and I'm grateful to be here as a panel again. And thank you for Professor Im Man-sung as well. So in my presentation, can you see my slides? Okay, I'd like to talk about the implications of the US-China competition for nuclear non-proliferation in South Korea, and more broadly speaking, Northeast Asia, from the perspective of international security studies. So I'll try to answer the following questions. What are the key nuclear non-proliferation challenges in Northeast Asia? What are the implications of the US-China strategic competition in nuclear non-proliferation? What should be done today to cope with the challenges? My presentation focuses on two major issues. First, it is about great power rivalry between the US and China, competing over hegemonic influence and the rules-based order in this region. Northeast Asia, as you all know, is concentrated with nuclear programs in terms of both military and civilian uses. It is also the geopolitical center where the US pivot to Asia and the rise of China encounter. The second, it is about alliance politics for nuclear restraint. To illustrate, the US as a defender in the region tries to optimize the risk of regional proliferation and the risk of entrapment, meaning a defender is dragged by allies' unwanted security interests. So these arrangements, including extended nuclear deterrence, are developed through bilateral alliances. So in March 2021 this year, the US and China sat in Alaska to exchange their views on bilateral relations. Despite the exchange of angry words, it's been told that the delegations worked through the list of agendas, including nuclear non-proliferation in Iran. We can also find out that they also support the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So to be sure, the US-China relationship has become bad, but there is continued and shared commitment to nuclear non-proliferation. There is weak evidence on whether nuclear weapon states provided nuclear assistance for military purposes. Regarding the NPT obligations, the nuclear weapon states largely comply with NPT Article 1, which prohibits the transfer of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. To the lesser extent of continued non-proliferation compliance, there is an ongoing debate regarding strategic stability among the US, Russia, and China. Since the US had been withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, the US and Russia extended the New START Treaty, for 5 years. In June, they agreed to begin mapping a new route to arms control as part of an effort to bring strategic stability. China's increasing missile silos are another concern. It would be difficult to imagine that China would participate in a trilateral arms control with the US and Russia in the near future. According to the head of arms control in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and I quote, China only intends to join the dialogue when American and Russian arsenals come down to a level of comparable to the level of Chinese nuclear warheads, end quote. So it means China may increase the number of stockpiles when the US and Russia arms control fails. Some analysts argued that the new silos may mean a possible shuffling of China's minimum nuclear warheads in more silos. But it could also be interpreted as the newly discovered construction of missile silos in China, which will increase pressure on both the US and Russia to conclude a deal for strategic stability. So in other words, the nuclear weapon states should further cooperate in complying with the NPT Article 6, which requires them to pursue nuclear disarmament. So although the NPT led the global nuclear non-proliferation regime, alliance politics has been another important mechanism to restrain nuclear weapons development in Northeast Asia. So for example, in South Korea, bilateral defense cooperation allowed the positive security assurance that the US as a defender would protect its South Korean ally in the case of an attack. In the 1970s, the US mostly orchestrated global nuclear suppliers not to provide sensitive materials and technologies to potential proliferators, including South Korea. Washington pressured Seoul commit to an emerging nuclear non-proliferation regime. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration enhanced its credibility of assurance to the ally on the Korean Peninsula. So throughout the measures of carrots and sticks, the bilateral relationship utilized the NPT as a platform to exchange extended nuclear deterrence and non-proliferation commitments. In terms of peaceful use of nuclear energy, civilian nuclear cooperation agreements also promoted non-proliferation rules and norms in South Korea. However, the significance of nuclear deterrence did not spare policy space for humanitarian approach to nuclear weapons. So consequently, it is hard to discuss the TPNW in Korean politics, despite the emergence of a new post-nuclear coalition in the energy sector. So in a nutshell, the US worried about nuclear proliferation and enhanced the security assurance for nuclear restraint in South Korea. In terms of the NPT, South Korea is a non-nuclear weapon state, fully complies with Article 2 and Article 3 that prohibits the transfer of nuclear weapons and other nuclear explosives and requires the acceptance of safeguard measures. So far, the great power rivalry and alliance politics seem to work quite well in a different manner. However, it creates serious challenges when these two are coupled. Most importantly, great power rivalry influences alliance politics to undermine non-proliferation efforts. There are three major issues regarding great power rivalry alliance politics nexus. So first, it could be more difficult to restrain North Korea's nuclear proliferation. To elaborate, it is noteworthy that China is moving closer to North Korea, or vice versa, amid the US-China strategic competition. China neither wants North Korea's nuclear weapons program, nor the instability of the Korean Peninsula. However, some experts argued that Beijing would choose to stabilize the Korean Peninsula rather than pressuring Pyongyang to restrain its nuclear program. When the US pressure increases, uncertainty over North Korea. Others may not share the role of US pressure against North Korea, but still the argument touches upon the consequences of great power politics over regional politics. The US should put more resources toward Pyongyang rather than Beijing to deal with North Korean nuclear program. So at the time of strategic competition, it will be more difficult for the US to seek cooperation with China on the North Korean nuclear issue. Second, it's about strategic competition that could undermine the reliability of extended nuclear deterrence. So for example, in 2016, the development of THAAD as part of the US missile defense at the US base in South Korea jeopardized the economic relationship between South Korea and China. Against the deployment, China reacted with economic coercion to forbid Chinese tourists to visit South Korea and impose sanctions on Lotte, a retail and chemical giant, which was commercially active in China. To further illustrate, South Korean nuclear nationalism emerged in 2017. This nuclear nationalism included securing independent enrichment and reprocessing capabilities and weaponized atoms. This is not new. Moreover, it can be found elsewhere around the world. However, nuclear nationalism in 2017 emerged both from the conservative and progressive political coalition in Korea. So some experts interpreted the new nuclear nationalism as based on the strategic thinking that indigenous nuclear deterrence might save South Korea from unwanted escalation of conflict between the US and North Korea, or between the US and China. These events imply that South Korea's nuclear nationalism could continue as the US-China competition increases, which will in turn increases the uncertainty of the regional order. Third, it is noteworthy that there's growing abuse of nuclear non-proliferation rules. For example, in 2017, Japan excluded South Korea from its preferred trading partners to tighten export controls of strategic items. Japan explained the measure is necessary to address illegal transfer of strategic items to North Korea. In turn, South Korea applied countermeasures by excluding Japan from its list of preferred trading partners. This feud over export control has been poorly justified later. Instead, unresolved issues on comfort women and enforced labor. These issues spilled over to non-proliferation export controls. So although the restrictive measures are not specifically targeting nuclear items, the abuse of national export control system could be translated into a wider discussion of weaponized interdependence. So in conclusion, strategic arms race and nuclear nationalism are the most contending non-proliferation challenges in Northeast Asia. The non-proliferation challenges emerge from regional conflicts rather than strategic competition between the US and China. The competition may accelerate and escalate regional conflicts. Washington and Beijing need each other to overcome the challenges of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. So there are some premature, and I have some premature suggestions for ways forward. So I think we should decouple great power rivalry and alliance politics. In doing so, maybe multilateral approaches to nuclear non-proliferation could contribute. Multilateral approaches should also increase the transparency and confidence of nuclear management in the region. So this is the end of my presentation, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jion, for your review of the non-proliferation challenges in the Korean Peninsula. Now we have about 20 minutes, and we will be having the last comment session by Dr. Francesca Giovannini. I should have pronounced the last name correctly. Okay, so Dr. Giovannini is the executive director of the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School Welfare Center. And also she's a non-residential fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. But as maybe many of you know, Dr. Giovannini served as a strategy and policy officer to the executive secretary of CTPTO. In that capacity, she oversaw a series of policy initiatives to promote CTBT's ratification as a confidence-building mechanism in regional and bilateral nuclear negotiations. And prior to this appointment, Dr. Giovannini served for 5 years at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston. And also, she was an adjunct associate professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where she designed and taught master's degree courses on nuclear policies and strategies. Okay, so let's invite her to make comments on these presentations.
Thank you so much, Professor Kim, for this very generous introduction, and good morning to you all from Harvard University, from Boston. It's such a pleasure to be here. I also want to thank very much my good friend and my colleague Wan Sung-him, who always put together a fantastic program. NEREC has really become an annual convening of bright minds to think about big issues in Asia and beyond. And so I really want to thank him for this, consistent commitment towards a very high quality discussion. I also want to very much thank and congratulate the three presenters who came before me, Saima, Jeon, and Sahil. I think you represent the best and the brightest of this new generation of scholars and thinkers who are able actually to bridge policy discussions and academic discussions. And so I want to focus my final remarks really in teasing out a little bit what I thought were the most important theoretical and policy questions that you all raised. And I want to do that trying to encourage the young people, the young students who are following this session, maybe to pick up one of these themes and run with them, decide to write either a thesis in their undergraduate degree or a master thesis or a dissertation on one of these topics. I think it's really important that especially when we approach nuclear discussions today, that we don't forget the bigger picture. There is often, and I believe some of you have already said this, right? When we are part of this nuclear community, we believe the nuclear weapons are the most important issue that defines world politics today. I think it is true that nuclear weapons cast a very long shadow, but it is also important that we put into context the discussions we are having today on nuclear weapons in broader trends of world politics, of global affairs, so that we can actually make an impact not only within our community, but also towards broader issues like governance, human rights, social justice, and so on and so forth. So let me tease out some of these big questions that, in my view, my three presenters actually raised in rather sophisticated ways. You all talked about great power politics. You've all opened with great power politics framework, and you talked about the competition among great powers. But competition, I have to argue, is a mean, is not an end to itself. So it is legitimate to ask, we are competing to do what? What is ultimately the end goal of these great power competitions? And I would argue that we are in a transitional phase. The great power competition has not yet arrived to define the world of tomorrow. We don't know how this world will look like. And this nostalgia that sometimes we hear, especially from older generations, of a return to the Cold War, in my view, is really misplaced. I think there are some urban legends about Cold War that we actually need really to challenge. The Cold War was neither stable or peaceful, and it was actually based on very minimal cooperation and a very high level of threats. Nuclear deterrence held hostages, cities, communities, societies. So the Cold War should not be, in my view, the end goal of great power politics tomorrow. There is overall an agreement, however. The great power politics and the definition of the world of tomorrow will have probably a transitional phase that we are probably living today that will not be necessarily peaceful or predictable. And so we are in a moment where, while we manage these great power competitions, we also need to think about the end goal. What is the world that we actually want ultimately to see? It is my belief that the world of tomorrow is not going to be a Cold War 2.0, and it's not going to be a world order either defined by China or the United States. But I see a world order composed by regional networks, regional communities that might actually end up coexisting if we actually think about ordering principles by which we can all live by. Nuclear deterrence might be one of the ordering principles, but it doesn't have to be the only one. And so when we think about great power competitions, I think you should all push the envelope and try to think, what is ultimately the end goal of this great power competition? It is a zero-sum game, or can it actually be a win-win situation where countries compete in a series of sectors, but also cooperate in another bunch of them? What are the areas of cooperation that we can actually all build on so that competition becomes more manageable and less risky? The second point I think is very interesting, and you've all made in a rather interesting way, is you've all called ultimately into question the concept of the alliance system. You know, alliances has a mixed bag of records, right? Day1 talks about alliances as a possibility of being a non-proliferation tools, right? So you are under a security umbrella, you have a series of guarantees, and that somehow might minimize your incentives to go nuclear. But Saima pointed out that actually alliances might in fact even heighten the risk of proliferation because they impose this forward deployment of nuclear weapons, like it is in the case of NATO. And because alliances always remind us ultimately of the centrality of nuclear weapons. So alliances are no longer the perfect tool of non-proliferation, and in fact, in some cases, might heighten regional insecurities. They might deepen, for example, the divide between outsiders and insiders. And Day1 talks about this nuclear nationalism that we have seen in display during the THAAD deployment in South Korea. So alliance system is a mechanism that might actually ultimately end up having serious security consequences. And we need to think about alliances no longer as an idealistic system, but we need to actually really understand how alliances play in specific regional contexts. I also want to mention that alliances is very much a US-Western concept. China and Russia are actually engaging with different types of influence building. China sees relations in a more transactional way. So we have seen China refusing over and over to build, for example, an alliance system. But China has an approach to trust and confidence building that goes through economic cooperation. The One Belt, One Road initiative is a way for China to develop a series of networks and structures around China. Russia instead operates with a more of a traditional, if you want, 19th century understanding, which is building spheres of influence. So alliance is not the only system that exists out there for great powers to extend their relations and their influence. We need to think about different concepts to see how this plays out in the security and insecurity within regions. I also want to mention, however, that the US system of alliance is in a phase of transition. I wouldn't say necessarily in crisis, but I think it is displaying some weaknesses. In Asia, for example, the alliance system of the United States is increasingly being called into question by the Chinese nuclear buildup, their development of military power. And so many within the region do question whether the alliance system, the security guarantees of the United States are in fact at all credible today. But this is also happening in the European context. And I want to mention something that I find very interesting. In the European context, particularly in the Mediterranean Sea, you are seeing today a heightening of rivalries among NATO alliances that actually have nuclear weapons. I'm talking in particular about Turkey, France, and Italy, for the competition within the Mediterranean Sea. So alliances do not resolve internal regional insecurities, as Saima said, but rather actually might heighten them ultimately, and with some serious consequences. Third point I want to make is Saima in particular and Jayon as well talked about this technology transfer that might become a very important strategic tool, again, in great power competition. The peaceful use of nuclear energy might become the next frontier of major competition and anxieties among non-nuclear weapon states. There is, of course, this technology nationalism that is emerging today. You have probably read the newspapers. Just recently, the United Kingdom forgo a Chinese investment for over 20 billion pounds for the repair and reconstruction of the Sizewell C nuclear power in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom rejected basically the agreement with China and basically claimed questions of national security. So technology nationalism will certainly play a role also in nuclear technology transfer. And we need to think about how structures like the Nuclear Suppliers Group might ultimately be affected by this great powers competition also in the technology transfer. What does this mean in the context of the NPT? Non-nuclear weapon states will promise the inalienable right of peaceful use of nuclear technology. But today the world is facing a resurgence of nationalism also in technology transfer. So what does this all mean, particularly in the context of the NPT? Let me then just say a few more words about three other concepts where I thought were very interesting. You all talked about Sahel in particular, but also Saima, these multilateral tools that today remain in limbo. You've talked about the fissile material cutoff treaty. You talked about the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. These multilateral tools, in my view, crashes today against a new reality. We have multilateral tools, but we have heightening regional insecurities. And we need to ask whether multilateral tools can in fact be sufficient to address regional problems, regional contexts. And in that I want to notice one worrisome trend. A few years ago, I did my PhD dissertation on regional nuclear cooperation. There was a moment in between 2000 and 2012 where regional powers from Indonesia to Brazil, from Mexico to Nigeria, were really investing resources in building regional nuclear institutions. You had the creation of African Commission of Nuclear Energy. You had the expansion of ASEAN nuclear portfolio. You had the Latin American nuclear cooperation agreement led by Brazil. But these regional efforts, for some reasons, have waned. Partly it's because the regional powers started confronting economic crises of their own. They started actually clashing maybe with other regional powers, the heightening of great power competition. So these regional nuclear experiments that could have really led to new interesting nuclear institutions have somehow stalled. I think it's important that we push forward for the ratification and the entry into force of the FMCT and the CTBT. But I think it's also important that we push forward regional nuclear solutions, regional nuclear agreements, where regional powers can sit at the table together and talk about their own regional intrinsic challenges. I think Saima mentioned the initiative of Pakistan. I think others can actually be taken around the world at the regional level. And in my view, there will be a form of new nuclear cooperation where something can be done when the global is somehow frozen because of great power competition. Two final points. Another very important relation that, in my view, scholars need to study very carefully is the relation between nuclear non-proliferation and the future of nuclear disarmament. I think on the nuclear disarmament front, there is something very interesting happening. And I want to share a little bit the concern that I had working for CTBT when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force. There are today two very different schools of thought when it comes to nuclear disarmament. A school of thought that is represented by the FMCT and the CTBT that believes that nuclear disarmament is attainable only through incremental steps, that you build trust, that you develop confidence, that you bring nuclear weapons states into the fold, and you basically create something from the ground up, but in an incremental way. There is, however, a new school of thought, which is very much represented by the TPNW, that believes that these incremental steps have fundamentally failed. That this is, yet again, an excuse for nuclear weapon states to remain nuclear weapon states, and that incremental steps just somehow buy time without leading to the end goal, which is a world free of nuclear weapons. The TPNW represents a new approach, which is to say, we don't go by increment, we go by revolution. We do a leap forward into banning nuclear weapons. I don't think we can dismiss the importance of these two approaches. These two approaches will ultimately determine how we look at nuclear disarmament in the future. And I think it's very important that as scholars, we engage with both. It will really give the TPNW the benefit of the doubt if this can be, in fact, the new approach to nuclear disarmament that can work. We have worked for 60, 70 years through incremental steps. TPNW offer a different approach and a different solution. I am agnostic about this, but I think it's important that we see both of these approaches in tandem, and we understand how this might ultimately impact global discussions about nuclear disarmament. Final point is about education. I said this often to my students, but I want to reiterate this. The new scholars on nuclear affairs comes into a world that is now defined by big, ambitious, broad questions. Questions about social justice, gender equality, racial reckoning, sustainability, climate change. And while we do appreciate the importance and the urgency of nuclear weapons, I beg you not to forget that nuclear weapons operate in context also shaped by these social trends and these social movements. It is really important that we engage with these discussions, and as nuclear community, we'd actually branch out also to these conversations where there is momentum, when there is energy. The climate change debate has real energy and real potential, and it would be a mistake to see this discussion separate from these broader trends. So I hope that you will embrace nuclear weapons discussions, that you will do your studies on nuclear weapons, but also thinking about the context in which these nuclear discussions take place. Because it's a context that is in transition and is very unclear the direction it's going to take. I stop there and I turn to you, Professor Kim.
Thank you, Dr. Giovannini. This is really, really wonderful comments, especially the last comment on broadening the nuclear community, non-proliferation community to broader issues. And I totally agree with what you just said. And we have about 5 minutes, but we just received a question online. And this is from Professor Martin Ziegler. Actually, he's a professor at KAIST. And the question is, what's your opinion on recent resumed talks between President Moon Jae-in and also Kim Jong-un? And this is directed to Day1. So, Day1, can you have something to say on this?
Well, I don't think talks has been resumed, but there were reconnection of communication lines between South Korea and North Korea. So, well, I don't have much to talk about the resumed talks, but I could only say that I see this reconnection of communication lines happening because of, largely because of COVID-19, actually. North Korea's economic situation is in crisis, simply speaking. So, but as we see that in North Korea, Kim Jong-un is talking about scolding their youth exposed to Korean cultures or punishing their officials about the grave concerns, etc., etc. I think this indicate that the North Korean regime, political regime stability is fine. North Korea maybe wants to resume talks because of economic crisis rather than political crisis. But because of the unique nature of North Korean regimes, economic crisis does not necessarily mean that they have a political crisis. So maybe that's all I can share. But hopefully the talks resume, and with this occasion, I totally agree with Dr. Giovanni's comments. And as a researcher in South Korea, as I said, there's very limited conversation about debate about the TPNW, but and I talked about nuclear nationalism. But also in South Korea, from maybe in 2017, there are emerging political coalitions taking over the government. So there's a fragmentation of the nuclear discourses in South Korea. So maybe it's not revolutionary change, but this fragmentation, I think, listening to actually this in South Korean time morning session provided by Professor Lee Marang, this kind of different discourses, I think, actually makes states difficult to mobilize resources to weaponize atoms, and in fact, it indirectly helps or delays the nuclear proliferation, which, at least from my view, it's realistic answer to the nuclear non-proliferation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your response. And we are almost on time, but still, I'd like to invite Sahel and also Saima just to respond to Dr. Giovannini's comments, just for very briefly. Maybe Saima, can you just give a few words? Or, yeah.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, no, those were, I think, great comments, and it made me thinking about, I think, 2 points that I particularly noted and were of great interest to me was this relationship between nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation, firstly, and I think there's great value in engaging with both sort of groups, and let's not, sort of go into a tunnel vision in how we want to think, because innovative approaches are always a part of interaction between the different camps, and there's always, that's how new ideas surface, and it's from small discussions, small but difficult discussions, that new ideas emerge, and then they can be taken forth. And secondly, I think, and that's also very important, about the regional conflicts, and she made a point about whether we want to have a trickle down effect, or we want to have approaches that start from the state itself. Now, I feel that the broader question that she initially made, where she said that is the great power competition an end in itself, I think that is also a very important point, because it is a means. And for us to understand that at the regional level, and to have innovative approaches amongst the regional states, like between India and Pakistan, I feel that there are systemic factors which are at play, which sort of undermine the prospects for regional arms control, because there's this Indian sort of desire to sit at a greater table, which hinders the prospects of discussing arms control issues bilaterally with Pakistan, and that has been a major casualty. So I totally relate to those points. And thank you so much.
Thank you. So Sahel?
Yeah, I mean, Francesca did an incredible job tying together so many different strands. And I think instead of commenting on the presentation, I just want to highlight the importance of Francesca's experiences now, before returning to academia. Now she's at the Balfour Center. We worked together at the CTBTO when she was the chief strategy officer in the executive secretary's office. And we've had many conversations during that period. And it really gives you an upfront view at what the international kind of community feels about a lot of the issues that are being discussed at the NEREC conference, and how all the regional groups, and especially those that come from the global south, have very muted that their views are often very muted in terms of we don't often get to hear them in public, but they're very much on full display. They're very robust, very evidence-based. And I think that it's really important that we start to have those perspectives surface more in public debates, because it's not fair that the oxygen is sucked out of the room often by the US, Russia, and China alone, or say the wider nuclear armed states. These are global issues. And if there is any form of nuclear use, whether by accident or miscalculation or on purpose, it will affect everyone. This concerns everyone. It concerns all generations. So I'm really pleased that the experiences that Francesca has had at the Commission will now help guide building a better talent pipeline, trying to inform how we think about these issues, and hopefully in a more inclusive way. And I think that it's great that NEREC brings together so many people from not just nuclear armed states, but also from across the world. I remember when I was a NEREC fellow, I think we had fellows from over 22 countries, which is just remarkable. So yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sahel, Saima, and also Jaewon for your responses. And this is almost the end of our session. But just before finishing this session, let me just ask whether our keynote speaker, Laura, has any last comment or observation to make?
It would be my pleasure. First of all, I am constantly impressed by the intellectual capacity of the younger people who are studying these issues. Really extraordinarily thoughtful, subtle arguments, and I listen to this and it gives me goosebumps, because there's so much intellectual power that can be directed at solving some of these problems. And what I particularly was impressed with Francesca, and I've known her for years, is how well she pulled together the points that were made by the speakers, but also put it into a broader context. And I found myself humbled by her words. We get so involved in our little world and our expertise that we perhaps we are tempted to stay within our safe areas of expertise. So I have to say, I took so much away from this session. You guys have such a great future in front of you, and if there's any way I can be of any help to any of you, please reach out to me, and really all the best of luck, and wonderful to see Sahil and Francesca. I've missed them, but now that we can start traveling, maybe we'll see each other in person. Thank you so much, So-Young, and to the professor who organized this. I'd love to be with you again next time.
Yeah, we really, really look forward to meeting all of you just in person, just very, very soon, when we overcome this COVID-19 crisis. And thank you everyone for joining this session in the evening, in the morning, and in the afternoon. And now this is really over. Thank you again. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.